So that was a pretty stimulating lecture. Here's a couple of points, key points that I got out of it, and then I'll open this to questions right off, and then I'll get to some other issues. One of the real interesting things he said at the beginning was that viruses don't want to kill people, basically. And the reason that something like Ebola is a problem is that it doesn't start off as a human virus. It's really most likely, the reservoir is probably bats, fruit bats, but that's never been proven. That already makes a problem for anybody that eating exotic food in West Africa right now. But when a virus starts to be able to be transmitted from human to human, if it doesn't match up with the immune response that a person has, that a human being has, it can then put the life of the person at risk. If people die from viruses, that's not what viruses, from an evolutionary point of view, want either. Which is why, as an outbreak continues, you start, and Ebola may be an exception to this, but as an outbreak continues, you actually usually see a decrease in the lethality rate, because it's the virus that can hop from host to host without killing it that's going to do better, and that's a Darwinian principle. In this case, the one thing he didn't emphasize, which I think is really crucial here, is that there's a very high viral load with Ebola for several reasons. And I could give you a very simple explanation for that and say it deactivates the immune response right when it's not detected right. But essentially, the reason that it becomes so deadly over the first week or so is because there's an unbelievable amount of virus circulating in the body. That's the biggest problem with it. You know, a lot of viruses don't have that. And so if you have that, it's a challenge to try to treat it. That's why the drug that's been getting a lot of press since Dr. Brantley and Nurse Reipold came back, ZMapp, the reason that that's getting a lot of press, that's an ingenious treatment, because what that does is, essentially it takes targeted antibodies, 3 of them, and they wrap around the virus at different parts of the virus and eliminate it. Well, if you can flood the body with antibodies, they're going to go right for those viruses. You're actually compensating for the body's inability to produce its own effective antibodies. If the body was producing enough antibodies, and this is very variable, and there was another study that showed, interestingly enough, that survivors of Ebola didn't, you would think from what I'm saying now, that all survivors of Ebola must have a much better immune response. But that's not true across the board. It's a very tricky virus. ZMapp works. What doesn't work well, and you guys have seen this too, what doesn't work well is passive immunity. You know, flooding, studies show that if you take immunity, if you take antibodies, and they're doing it anyway. They're doing it anyway, they're doing it with that other American doctor now. If you take antibodies from a recovered person, as opposed to something like ZMapp, and you put it, and you transfuse it, it doesn't have much of an effect in terms of what keeps the person alive. So, go ahead.
Is that because the virus is very mutable?
It's mutable, but not in the way that it scares people. Yeah, it eludes. Well, that's one thing. And the other issue is what I've already said. The viral load is so high that you can put in a lot of antibodies and you're still not going to be able to effectively neutralize it. And another thing, and I think he did say this point, another thing, this is the third answer to your question, the biggest problem with Ebola is not the virus itself, even though I just said the virus load is so high, it's what it does in terms of inflammation. It immediately causes a cytokine reaction. It goes for blood vessels and to the endothelium of blood vessels, and you end up, that's why a high percentage of people die from hemorrhagic fever, from bleeding from the GI tract, because bleeding from the GI tract and coagulation problems and problems, blood clotting problems, because the Ebola virus goes for the endothelial lining of blood vessels. And it causes an inflammatory response, which is essentially an anti-immune response. But here's another thing, and this has been some misinformation in the media. The ZMapp is not the answer to this. I mean, even if we can make millions of doses of it, antiviral treatments are not what gets rid of epidemics, because you can't effectively contain a viral outbreak using them. They're good on a case-by-case basis. I'll get into a little bit later what the way that this outbreak has to be handled and what some of the problems are in terms of the way it is being handled. But I wanted to stay on the virus for a while. Any more questions on the Ebola virus? I'm going to get into the clinical side of it too. So the typical, so here's some things you probably have heard already. It can take up to from 2 to 21 days from the time you're exposed to an Ebola virus before you start having symptoms. In that period of time, you can't transmit it. It's because of this viral load issue. It's only because the Ebola virus is so hard to transmit, and I was so happy to hear him say at the end of this lecture, and I think I heard this right, younger people with better hearing, didn't he in fact say because of the cell biology, it's very unlikely that this would become airborne? Because that's what Tony Fauci has been saying for the last several days, and Tony is a bench scientist, and he's, by my estimation, the top infectious disease expert in the country, and I interviewed him twice last month, and he, on radio, on TV, and he's been saying it in all the papers. He does not feel it's going to happen, that this virus is going to become airborne. Now why, and it's related to this issue I'm going to get back to of how you have a prodromal period before you're sick. Why isn't it going to become airborne? Number one reason, well, you talk about the cell biology. Sanders talked about the cell biology. The other reason is that it's a stable virus. You know, and I wish that the fearmongers out there would make this distinction. And I want to make an important distinction between influenza, which I've written a lot about, and Ebola. Ebola, Zaire, which is the cause of the current epidemic, has been around since 1976. It was discovered in the Democratic Republic of Congo, right near the Ebola River, which is how it got its name. It hasn't changed appreciably. There's 5 subtypes of Ebola, 4 affect humans. They have not changed. They're not mutating in a significant enough way to change their transmissibility, their lethality, their virulence. They're not changing. So then you're going to ask, and Dr. Sanders answered this already, but it was part of the viral talk towards the end. Then why are we having this problem? Why are we having this problem? The answer is simple, because the regions that are affected right now are mainly urban. And when you have people closely packed together that are full of fear, don't know how to prevent spread, they don't know how to isolate patients. I mean, I thought that the article in the New York Times today was tremendous. Looking at, if you haven't read it, on the front page of the Times today, there's an article about Sierra Leone closing down for 3 days. Yeah. Now I'll talk about that in a few minutes, but I wanted to point out that it's a big problem because of the urban areas. You know, that it's gotten into the cities, and these regions haven't seen Ebola before. Previous Ebola outbreaks were in rural areas, and so then you could send public health experts swarming in and get the case isolated, control the fear, and then it dies out. Why does it die out? By the way, Jeff, I was told 5 times never to say the term die out on television because it scares people. So if you say the Ebola outbreak will die out, you're sending a mixed message. So, where was it? Yeah, so urban areas, because everybody's tightly packed together. That's probably the explanation for the Spanish flu in 1918 that everybody brings up all the time. Because in 1918, people were in trenches. People were close together. They didn't have knowledge. The same kind of fear component was there. But here's the difference between influenza and Ebola that's germane to this whole question of airborne that keeps coming up. The fearmongers attached to influenza back in 2005 and 2006 with H5N1, and they said, this is going to mutate and it's going to start killing millions of people. Well, because it killed millions of birds. But when they tried to induce those mutations in the laboratory, they were very difficult. And I want you to understand, even from his lecture, because he didn't make this point, even if you do induce the mutations in the laboratory, even if you can do that, there's no reason to believe that those same mutations are going to occur in the real world. In the real world, even in a virus that mutates constantly, like influenza, not Ebola, influenza, it's very rare that the mutations would occur in a way that you would predict the worst case scenario. So that's the thing that we need to be comforted by and reassured. I mean, even if you could induce this mutation in the laboratory, and I'm not convinced that the research shows that for Ebola, even if you could, there was one study with the one Ebola strain that doesn't go from human to human, that could be made to go from a primate to a pig. That was a Canadian study last year. I don't know that that's relevant. I think that there's no evidence that even in the laboratory that you could make this sustained spread because of the cell biology that Dr. Siegel was talking about. So that's the Ebola virus. That's how it works. What does it do to you? So 2 to 21 days, you can't spread it. You're not sick. After that, you start having flu-like symptoms. You get fever of over about 101.6. You get headaches. You get muscle aches. You get diarrhea. People are saying, listen to this, that sounds like the flu. But that's the problem, actually. You know, that's the issue with controlling this from a point of view of airports, you know, public health. How do you differentiate in the first days of Ebola from any other flu? You can't. And the reason that the symptoms play out this way is because of what I just said when I explained the pathophysiology of Ebola. It's not yet swarming. It's not yet causing that degree of cytokine problems. It's not causing that degree of inflammation. After 3 to 5 days, you start to see it affect the endothelial cells. Then you get rashes. Then you get problems with coagulation. Then you get hemorrhaging. Then you get shock. So it's the challenge is to recognize it when it's symptomatic before it's deadly. It's impossible to recognize it before you have it, but you could, if you have public health detectives around, public health detectives can say, okay, look, here's a patient with Ebola. I just isolated this patient, but wait a minute, you know, this is a person washing them that shouldn't have been. You go around the household. What contact did you have? You could, if you knew what you were doing, you could isolate an entire household where you felt that the contact that they had had with the patient somewhere in Sierra Leone or in Liberia or in Guinea was not ideal for preventing spread. You could isolate an entire household. Now the hope is that that's what's going to happen now. That's the hope. But if you read that article in the New York Times today, there was another layer to this, and it's what I've written about. I wrote a book on fear, and about how fear is a worse virus than the actual virus. Because if you bring the military in, and I'm not talking about, there's two issues here. One is Sierra Leone is being closed for 3 days. That's one issue. The other is that the United States has sent in 3,000 military and is building 17 centers for treating Ebola in Liberia, which is 100 patients each. And public health experts are going in. And hopefully we'll teach people around what the public health is that we need to worry about. Those are two different issues. Because I don't know what the military is going to do. I have a concern. It's the same concern I have about Sierra Leone now over the next 3 days, which is this. The place is already full of fear. What is the fear going to do in terms of spread? In the Middle Ages, when people were subject to the plague, they panicked. And when the so-called military of the time came in and tried to cordon off areas, people panicked. They tried to escape. They were afraid they'd be trapped with plague victims. And you know what they did when they tried to escape in panic? They spread plague. Because people that are panicking don't take any precautions at all. And that's one of the reasons that this outbreak hasn't been controlled, is the fear of healthcare workers. Now in Liberia, that's improving. It's got to be improved. The only way to improve it is through education, not through military force. Military force is going to have the opposite effect historically. So we need to figure out a way to teach people what the public health measures are. Well, what are the public health measures? It's simple. Isolate, we already talked about it. It's isolating sick people. It's isolating their close contacts. It's finding a place where you can put them, which is not true in these countries yet. That's why I think building these centers is a great idea. A place where they can go to actually be isolated, receive hydration. You know, we've been talking for weeks and weeks and weeks about the death rate of this, but it's variable. And if you catch it early, antiviral treatments or no antiviral treatments, if you hydrate the patient, if you keep their temperature down, if you're watching them closely, the chances of survival go way up. Just to give you an idea, The other article I would look at, by the way, that I thought was tremendous, other than the Times article today, there's an article in National Geographic out over the past week about how this looks from the point of view of sociology. And that's what Dr. Sundles was saying at the end there. You know, what's the cultural, what's the societal implications of this? It's not only a medical problem, you know, and we saw it with the closing of the Jim Yong Kim, president of the World Bank, estimates that the gross domestic product loss to these three countries, these main three countries that are the ones affected, is going to be $360 million over the next year, and could get as high as $800 million, a huge part of their gross domestic product. Why? Well, because unemployment is soaring, because farmers are running away, so there's no crops. And 90% of the economic losses are estimated to stem from fear. 90%. So it's not like patient gets Ebola, they can't work. Instead, person's afraid of Ebola and says, I'm not staying around here. Who knows when I'm going to see an Ebola patient in the market? So, you know, we're talking about 4,000 plus people sick in a country of millions and millions of people. And it's impossible for human beings to keep that in perspective. But if you take nothing else away from today, I want you to think about this, that the numbers are not what you think they are. I mean, it's, you know how many times I interviewed a guy that got off a plane from West Africa, and I said to him, what was it like on that plane? And he said, it was panic. Everybody was really worried. They were reading the headlines. I said, what do you think the chances actually were in a country of millions and millions of people? And it wasn't even one of the countries, of course, because it was a direct flight to JFK, that even had Ebola, but everybody's worried. They're going to get it. They're looking at the guy next to them. Are they sneezing? Are they coughing? The biggest virus in a situation like this is fear. It's the perception that it's going to happen to us. And the question is it going to come to the United States? He handled that beautifully. The answer is, in 2009, there was a case of Marburg virus in Colorado. And Marburg is very, very close to Ebola. It's a very similar virus. If we have a case of Ebola here, we're going to go crazy, talking about got to shut down this city, that city. One case. Well, the case of Marburg never spread. You know, they contained it, they put him in isolation. I mean, that's why the conversation about whether this doctor and this nurse should have been brought here was ridiculous. Because they were putting, they put them in these containment facilities that were built for respiratory viruses, and Ebola is not a respiratory virus. You know, you can only get it by direct contact with secretions, with bodily secretions or objects that they are in direct contact with. Medical equipment. That's why healthcare workers are at risk. You're not getting it from casual contact. You can't get it from sneezing on someone, shaking somebody's hand. You get it from direct and prolonged contact with bodily secretions. We experienced the same kind of issue with HIV back in the 1980s. Everybody thought, and I was in my residency in the late 80s, and I felt I was going to get it just by working at the bedside of someone with HIV. You know, we were afraid to shake hands of anybody with HIV. It's a psychological reaction. No matter what you know, no matter what you learn about a virus, it's a psychological reaction to feel. I mean, didn't you all cringe when you saw Bradley hugging everybody? Well, it's not the way that the virus is transmitted. And then, of course, there's a period after you recover, you're not infectious. See if I was.
This is so important. Why don't the journalists, the medical journalists, get this out into the...
You wanted a separate lecture on that?
Oh my God, that's what we need.
Well, this is how I talk, because I want people to be informed.
Right.
This is me. The fact is that the first problem with the media is they don't always have the right people talking about things. I mean, do you really want to hear I don't know what specialty to name, but like somebody in some specialty that has nothing to do with viruses. I mean, I've written books on this, on these outbreaks. I don't know why, like, they'll call somebody who has nothing to do with this to say, and then the person looks into the camera and says, very importantly, it could become airborne.
Oh,
Well, how do they know that?
Yeah.
How do they know that? Anything could, right? So the media is not interested in informing people. It's interested in ratings. They follow the ratings, and they're interested in the ratings, and fear sells. So even if they're not directly selling fear, it's not as diabolical as you think. It's not that somebody sits there and says, let's put this person on, they're scared. That's not what they do. They think they're getting a responsible person on. But then the next day they look at the ratings and they say, wow, they're rated, let's put him back. They don't really look at the medical accuracy part. And that's my trademark, and I wish more people would do it, but I've spent my whole career on this issue. And by the way, it's hard even for me. I don't always get it right. In 2009, I got caught up in the swine flu, H1N1, and I was interviewing people and writing a book on it, and I saw it in my mind as a pandemic. You know, but actually, I ended up more on the side of fear than I should have been. And a lot of people got vaccinated that didn't need to, and you know, and then of course, here's the other little trap. If the public health measure, if things go away, the public health measures work, right? So everybody takes credit for it. I mean, that's.
Well, what about the killing of those medical aid people that the,
Right, they just did
they just did the other day? Why are we putting that in there? And that's because, that's the fear.
And we're sending a message that it's easier to get this virus than it really
Right.
is. We don't know the exact, it's like Fauci said to me, he said, if you follow the protocol, 90, almost all the time, you're not gonna get this virus. But the problem is, he may have not followed the protocol one time, and he gets it. But that doesn't mean that every healthcare worker is gonna get it.
In the 1980s, the 80 biology students here were saying that they would never have normal life, they would never have normal relations, it would be impossible, and I told them that their knowledge would insulate them. And in fact, of course, we see that AIDS is a very fragile virus. It has never become airborne. You know, there's a fear, again, the whole thing.
But the fear.
Yeah, and there was a modality for spreading HIV, of course, that is not present here.
This is off the beaten track, but right now there is, everybody's getting the flu shot, and they came out with the suggestion that older people get this stronger flu shot now. Do you feel, I don't know if you know, I don't know the name of it, but.
No, I know what you're talking about. It's flu season, I mean, it's not flu season, it's flu shot season now.
Right.
You have two choices with that. With an elderly person, you could do it two ways. You could do this more powerful shot. Here's the point. Elderly people don't have the same reaction to a flu shot. So, you know, they're not all going to get immune. In fact, 2 years ago, there was a terrible, last year, there was a terrible statistic that only 9% of elderly actually the flu shot worked. So I'm for getting them a hyperimmune response. There's two ways you can do it. The way I usually do it is I give them 2 flu shots a year. The other way to do it is this way. I was a little leery on this before, but this past year they came out with a great study on it. Now I'm convinced it's safe. So I think for people that are over the age of 70, I would say, and especially those with underlying medical problems, where flu is an enabler. I call flu an enabler. That 34,000 deaths a year from flu is more from other things besides flu. It knocks you down and then something else takes over. You know, flu is not that deadly, it's just that it knocks you out. Yeah. So I'm in favor of that for elderly, especially those with other medical problems.
Thank you.
So, if I could go back to what David Sanders was saying at the end, I thought I did hear him say that his research showed that the Ebola virus could enter the host of the apical member.
Yes.
So this helped us understand that, together with the fact that it can't be transmitted. It's not a respiratory virus, it can't become airborne.
Well, because the difference there is, can it get into a respiratory droplet that flies through the air and infects somebody else?
Okay.
That's what it doesn't do.
Good.
By the way, it can do that. Anything can do that. Anything can do that. But I'm sorry. Before I get to Jeff Taubenberger at the NIH, he's the head of the flu unit or the viral unit down there. He's the one that discovered the 1918 flu. And he said he's still not convinced it's even a bird virus. It may not have mutated the way everybody said. It may just be that it came from some strange exotic animal that no one has ever identified. He doesn't think it's a bird virus. So we come up with all of these assumptions, and then people go on TV and they say this is going to happen again. And that's the scare thing. So
Deep question. So if a person does recover, they're not shedding the virus after that for a period of time?
This is a great question, and you know, the only thing is, there was a case of a man where they found the Ebola virus in his semen a month later. But that's not the same thing as saying it's infectious. I mean, I don't know. I think they'd have to study the issue of sexual transmission more. But basically, a week after your full recovery, you're not considered to be contagious.
And can you get it twice?
Well, that's a really great question. As a biologist, I don't want that. It should protect you for 10 years. The antibodies that you make in recovering from Ebola should protect you for 10 years. It's not a lifetime immunity. But it's not going to be, I mean, I don't, this is a very unusual epidemic that's here. You know, I think that now with all the attention to it, they're going to get control over it. If they really can get, and again, that's why I love that New York Times piece today, if they really can get to the cultural issues. I mean, somebody's lying in the street like in that story, and the wrong ambulance comes. You guys should read that story if you haven't read the Times yet today. The wrong ambulance comes, or some rickety ambulance pulls up. A woman is lying in the street in the capital of Sierra Leone, in, what is it called, Freetown? Lying in the street with fever, muscle aches, clearly looks like that she may have Ebola. An ambulance pulls up, a rickety ambulance. They get out and they say, no, we're not picking her up. And they drive off. And this is like after she's lying there for hours. Then another ambulance comes, which is equipped for an Ebola patient. They pick her up and they take her off. This is after she's been lying there for several hours. And the article points out, but who knows where they're even bringing her? Because there's no, you know, Ebola facilities. And then, you know, you've all read that there's cultural issues with washing dead bodies and issues of when someone's sick, the culture there is when they're sick, you're supposed to get in and help them. It's a way of showing your affection and caring. Well, that's not how we are here, right? Somebody's sick, we're like, stay away from me. And in Japan, much worse than us. You know, I remember once I was giving a lecture to a Japanese audience, and there was a translator, not in Japan, but in New York. There was some business audience, and all of them were wearing masks. And I was talking about flu. So at one point I said, what are you guys wearing masks for? And then it turned out that that's like the culture. When they're in a crowded area, they wear a face covering. So they're very, very hypersensitive. We're concerned about respiratory virus transmission in Japan. Here, we're less so. We cough on each other, we sneeze on each other. Schools are petri dishes. But I think when somebody's sick, we at least know to stay away from them. And that's not true over there. They're in on it. And that's one of the reasons Ebola spread. Anyone else? Let's see if I cover everything. That's my daughter. You have any questions? Oh, a couple more things. Food prices are up in Sierra Leone. Food prices are up. Farmers are running away, fleeing in fear. People are trying to avoid crowded markets, which is affecting the commerce. And schools have closed. And 70% of the public in Sierra Leone is already illiterate. So, you know, the whole idea of spreading information is going to be very, very difficult. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming.
Oh, wonderful, Jill.
We
Wonderful. Thank
have
you
a
so
service to
much.
75 over there. There are only about 10 of us, so everybody has to eat 7 times as much. So the muffins each has gone down, yeah.
I really learned a lot.